Hello and welcome to DC Legacy Filmcast, the show about DC Comics on the big screen. I'm your co-host, Chris Ayers.
And I'm your other co-host, Dennis Cooper.
So far we have covered Superman and the Mole Man in 1951, and of course Batman, 1966, on the big screen. And now we've made our way up to probably the most influential and important DC Comics movie on the big screen, 1978, Superman, directed by Richard Donner. And to help us get through this movie, we have a very special guest with us, the man who killed Superman and the man who is currently shepherding him through a rebirth of sorts in the pages of Action Comics, Dan Jurgens. Welcome, Dan.
Welcome, Dan.
Hi, glad to be here.
Hi. So first, a question I want to ask you, did you get to see this on the big screen when it came out?
Yes, I did.
So what was that like at the time, being the biggest and first, really, Superman comic book movie on the big screen?
It was an amazing experience. I was a college student at the time, and a couple of buddies and I went, to either the first or second night. It was open, kind of dead of winter, very cold. And what I remember most is that as soon as the credits came on, knowing that I was in for a special ride and some kind of treat, because and this is what's always hard about going back and looking at something all these years later, is that, 5 years after that, we were seeing credits like that on TV all the time. But when that three-dimensional credit kind of came zooming out at us, as viewers, that was brand new. And we certainly knew we were in for a treat.
So we should put this in some kind of context, because Star Wars had come out about a year and a half prior to this. And there's a lot of, I think, connections you can draw from Star Wars. Star Wars, of course, sort of redefined what you could do with a big action blockbuster. And there's some elements, I think, that carry over in this. For instance, one of the production designers, John Barry, was a production designer on Superman. David Prowse, who was the man in the suit for Darth Vader, auditioned for the Superman role, was rejected, but then he was the one who trained Christopher Reeve, physically to get his muscle mass up.
Oh, interesting.
And then, of course, John Williams, like
right.
You say, with the opening score, zooming through space with that John Williams theme,
right,
must have put people in the mind of Star Wars, of course.
And of course, Star Wars had its own unique credit treatment, but I don't know this, but it was is if Superman that they kind of said, okay, we'll see you in Rays, and because I think they absolutely did.
Yeah, for sure. So it's funny, this opens up with sort of this vignette that states clearly this is a comic book movie. It opens up with this recreation of Action Comics.
Right.
Which up to this point, this, was really the first big screen, big budget comic book movie. I don't want to discount the Adam West Batman movie, but, that was relatively low budget and a lot less stakes, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that the opening scene was really had a lot of mixed messages with the comic book, but it was in like newsreel footage, but then it had a child narrator. It was interesting, but kind of confusing. It didn't really fit in with the rest of the movie, I didn't think.
It seems like with the child narrator, they were kind of saying that, this may have been kid stuff. Like, it's still from a kid's perspective, but here's like the adult, we're taking this very seriously version of it.
Right. It does put Superman's creation in 1938 on the screen.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's important to recognize. I was just going to mention that really at that point, we're 40 years after Action 1 had come out.
Right.
But I think it's also important to note that if you go back to the publicity that existed before the movie, there were a couple of things I think that were fairly important. And one of them was the tagline that said, "You will believe a man can fly." And so I think even starting with that, they almost seemed to take the audience's recognition that this was a comic book character and could be kind of campy a la Batman or whatever, and deal with it just in that pre-publicity phase of saying, "You will believe a man can fly." And in addition to that, I thought what was so effective is there were billboards and like double-page spread ads in Life magazine that just zoomed in on a pair of hands ripping open the shirt and revealing the S symbol, which I thought were incredibly effective. And so right away, I think even at that step, even before you sat down and started to watch the movie, they were dealing with that idea that we know you think of this as a comic book. We're going to take you beyond that.
Yeah, it's great to have someone's perspective who remembers that marketing stuff too, for context, because I have a confession. I didn't see this on the big screen. I have a pretty good alibi. I was only 4 months old when it came out. When I think of these Superman movies, the Christopher Reeve movies, they all kind of blended together for me for a while. I remember watching a lot of them on TV, and as if it was just all one big tale. I couldn't separate them in my mind. And then later, yeah, as a late teenager, I kind of understand the difference in these.
I was 5 years old when this movie came out, and at the time, I was already a huge Superman fan from the Super Friends, from watching the Super Friends. I remember one year my mom made me a Superman costume. I'm air quoting here, for Halloween, but it was the 70s, and I guess she didn't really know what Superman looked like. So I was running around I'm a blonde kid with a bowl cut, with a like red domino mask over my eyes. I do have a cape, but then I have a sweatshirt that has the iron-on letters that say Superman. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so everyone could read who I was, but
well, you were a
time,
parallel universe Superman.
Parallel universe Superman, yes.
Yeah, we're not judging.
Right.
So did you see it on the big screen when it came out?
I saw it on the big screen when it came out, and I just ate it up. I loved it so much as a 5-year-old. It came out in December, which my birthday was in December, so
right.
It was a real treat to go see that. I think it was one of the first movies that I saw in the theater. I'm pretty sure I saw Pinocchio and some other movies beforehand, so that I was trained to behave in the theater. But
it should also be noted that the big idea is this huge cinematic universe, and this is really sort of the first comic book cinematic universe, because there's like 6 films that take place in this. If you count the Supergirl spin-off, and if you count Superman Returns, which takes place sort of somewhere in this timeline,
right? Kind of.
So that's that. If you think about it, that's pretty impressive. They had 6 films in this universe.
That is pretty impressive.
So I guess we should mention Mario Puzo, the screenwriter, of course, wrote The Godfather, wrote the first screenplay for this thing, which turned out to be enormous, which they ended up having to break into 2 films. But there are actually some parallels with The Godfather. If you think about it, sort of, it's the story of an immigrant, sort of this long, ponderous story of an immigrant coming to America, sort of learning what it is to be American, and then gaining power all over time. And the other Mario Puzo screenplay he had was Earthquake a couple of years prior, which actually figures into the third act of this film. And of course, you can't give all the credit to Mario Puzo, because we also had Tom Mankiewicz, who came in later and helped sort of polish the draft and work it into a shootable script that they could produce, in one film. But the stories, they were producing Superman 1 and 2 simultaneously, so the shoot on this must have been intense. And they were able to attract some of the stars, because they were able to get Marlon Brando, probably because of his Godfather connection, to play Jor-El. And they've gotten a lot of use of that Jor-El footage all the way up through Superman Returns.
Yeah, not just have they gotten use out of the footage, they've gotten use out of the entire concept. Because really, it's that movie that introduced the concept of Jor-El kind of serving as sort of almost a Sherpa of sorts, where, he's along with baby Kal-El on the rocket to Earth, kind of educating him, and then has that role that exists further. And that's all new to that movie.
So previously in the comics, was it just you'd see a little intro with Jor-El, a few pages, and then it was gone?
Yeah, it was basically he died on Krypton. And I think it was the movie that gave us this idea of the Kryptonian crystals and this concept of a further role for Jor-El than just putting the baby in a rocket and shipping him off. And as far as I can recall right now, all of that was new to the movie. And since then, it has absolutely become, I think, sort of bedrock Superman lore.
Right.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, every new version of the retelling of it, Mark Waid, John Byrne, Jeff Johns, they all sort of add this, like you said, a Sherpa effect of Jor-El, and having him explore his culture, understand his culture via these artifacts. So I was wondering, I think I kind of know the answer to this, but why an ice planet for Krypton? Because that depiction has stuck with us for a while, at least in the Fortress of Solitude, the ice crystal idea.
It does make sense with the way the Fortress of Solitude looks encased in ice, but it doesn't. As Krypton, it's just so cold and antiseptic and not a very nurturing place.
I suspect it was a lot to do with the budget. Like, it was an easy thing to construct and build these small models, and just these long, geometric planes that were just pretty easy to construct in a very short amount of time. Because the first things they shot were the Krypton scenes.
I would also wonder if it wasn't chosen, and I think there are always practical reasons like that, and I have no idea if this is true, but if you carry it to the sort of next level, there is something about if you start to just think about what represents life, what represents death, and certainly a cold, barren place that has no plant life growing, nothing green to it, or anything like that, does start to suggest this idea of death, where the only life on the planet are the people who are left alive. God only knows what they ate. But I think it set us up to realize that that's a doomed world.
Yes.
Yeah. It was a strange alien culture, even though these were humans. The way they lived seemed very odd.
Yeah, the only color on the planet is Kal-El's blanket. Yeah, so he really sticks out. Everything is glowing white or black or crystalline see-through. I guess there is a green crystal that eventually becomes the Fortress of Solitude, but
I mean, they even put the good guys in white and the bad guys in black in terms of the Phantom Zone criminals, and it was all very easy to understand.
Yeah, sure. I think also there's a lot of other cold sci-fi at this time in the mid to late 70s. If you think of like 2001 Space Odyssey or Logan's Run or George Lucas's THX 1138. Seemed like that perception of sci-fi was very cold and alien.
The way they did the Phantom Zone in this movie was just so creepy and haunting, and just stayed with me as a 5-year-old as like the worst thing that could happen, to be sucked into the two-dimensional plane and tossed into space just seemed so awful. I remember when that happened, just being shocked and horrified.
I have always wondered if that's a sequence that people saw at the time and had no idea what was going on. It's almost as though you had to have a bit more knowledge of the Superman world than what they actually showed us at that time. That, I mean, I knew what was going on, but friends who were with me, who were not comic book readers, did not. And I've heard that from other people as well, that it was a little... like they put those 3 people in a record album, and what happened after that? So, yeah.
It's also a bit of a weird thing that this doesn't really pay off until the sequel, and they weren't even sure the sequel was going to happen. Like, it's a weird thing to introduce these 3 the criminals, especially Terrence Stamp, a recognizable actor, who's not going to show up again until the next film.
Yeah. And
also at that point, we don't really know much about the culture here, so we don't know, exactly why they're being sentenced, or even if the council are even really good guys. It's like. Right. You might have a little sympathy for the criminals. And, you've got to point out the cautionary tale that keeps repeating itself of the destruction of Krypton, which is unfortunately still very relevant, and the sort of climate change deniers. It's always, if we don't change what we're doing, we're all going to be destroyed. And, of course, no one listens to the scientists. And the destruction of Krypton lasts a very long time. We're about 23 minutes into the movie, and a couple minutes of that are literally just explosions. Which, again, sort of references Star Wars and the Death Star explosion when Krypton finally is destroyed. It's
also probably their perhaps either weakest or second to weakest special effects sequence. That there were parts of that really do not look very convincing.
Well, they were very convincing to me as a 5-year-old, though.
Oh, I'm sure.
those people falling, it looked like they were burning and going to hell. It was terrifying. As a kid to watch that.
So Richard Donner stated, or I think maybe it was Tom Mankiewicz stated, they had intentionally made 3 different movies in here. You start off with the cold Krypton, and then you contrast that with the warm sort of pastoral Kansas, middle America. They said they wanted to reference like a Norman Rockwell or an Andrew Wyeth painting.
Yep. There's the shot when Clark is leaving Smallville and he's talking to his mom in the wheat fields. It's totally like Christina's World, the Andrew Wyeth painting, the way it's set up.
Yeah, it's such a huge contrast between those two. And here's a really strange thing that always strikes me. They cast a young Clark, the guy named Jeff East, who was only 5 years younger than Christopher Reeve. He was about 20 when they shot this, and Christopher Reeve was 25. And I know there's some transformation supposed to take place when he becomes Superman, but it always seemed odd to me because he doesn't really look that much like Christopher Reeve, this young guy. They had to give him a fake nose. They dubbed over his lines with Christopher Reeve's voice. I don't quite understand that choice. I always thought that was kind of strange.
Well, I think they wanted to show the passage of time. It is like 12 years from when he leaves Smallville to when he first appears as Christopher Reeve in the Superman suit.
And not just that, but we are supposed to understand a spiritual and kind of physical transformation to have taken place there. It isn't perfect, but in some ways it works better than you might have thought going into it.
Yeah, it would be. I mean, there's a transformation from scene to scene between Christopher Reeve as Clark and as Superman himself. But so I guess maybe that was necessary to have this other guy being a pre-Christopher Reeve Superman. And then we got a couple cameo appearances here on the train as young Clark is racing the train. Kirk Allen and Noel Neill from this old Superman serial, the pre-George Reeves Superman serial.
Right.
Very interesting. And there's a young Lois on the train, which is a nice little Easter egg in there. So then we arrive at the death of Pa Kent, which is really a defining moment in every telling of that Superman story. And I just love that idea, and Clark expresses it out loud. It's all these things I can do, all these powers, but I can't save him. And it's just a beautifully poetic moment.
And I would also add that Glenn Ford as Pa Kent was absolutely spot on, perfect casting.
Yeah. I'll bring this back to Star Wars because I think these scenes at the Kent farm, they really evoke the Luke Skywalker on Tatooine, kind of longing for that larger world, kind of staring off into the distance. It's really that Clark is the farm boy archetype.
Was this shot after Star Wars had already come out, or had some of it been in production?
I'm actually not sure. I mean, I don't know if it's a direct influence on it.
Right.
They came out about a year and a half after Star Wars, but it could have been shot around the time it came out. I'm not sure. And then we get Clark discovering his history via the ship that he arrived in. The cut to him hiking through the Arctic, I'm not exactly sure how we logically arrived at that scene where he discovered something in the ship that told him to go there. I'm not sure. Do you have any opinion on that?
I think that is one of those things that, he had the crystal. I've always assumed that the crystal kind of functioned like a compass and drew him there.
Right.
You could, I think, look at that as working any one of a number of different ways, but because it's Kryptonian technology, which we can say was a little fuzzy anyway, and even if it's just go north, young man, that somehow that's what drew him there.
Yeah, I think the crystal acted as a beacon, that this was Jor-El's plan all along to build the Fortress of Solitude at the North Pole. When Jor-El does speak to him, he says, "By now it's your 18th year as you measure years on Earth."
I never really consciously thought about it until rewatching it again this month. I mean, it's always just accepted that's where the Fortress of Solitude is. And then when you kind of logically break it down, I'm not sure how you get there, but that makes sense.
I was going to say something that doesn't make sense to me is when Jor-El first speaks to Kal-El in the Fortress of Solitude, and he says, "By now I will have been dead for thousands of years as you measure time." And then later, Lex Luthor puts it together that Krypton exploded in 1948, and it took Superman 3 years to get to Earth, and therefore, the kryptonite is landed in Addis Ababa, and they've got to go get it. How has he been dead for thousands of years if he's only... it just doesn't make any sense.
Maybe we can ask Neil deGrasse Tyson to explain space-time
right,
to us.
Right.
Kryptonian space-time.
I don't see anything that is necessarily inconsistent there. That if you look at it from Jor-El's perspective, and however that ship came to Earth, whatever warp it might have gone through to get here, et cetera, he has the more complete understanding of it than does Luthor. What Luthor knows is Superman is X number of years old. I think you got here, and that. Luthor is using Earth understanding, and 20th century Earth technology. Whereas
right.
I think we can assume that Jor-El has a better handle on things. I don't think those are incompatible.
Right. Well, it's just how does the logic of the rocket, traveling, and then the meteors from the destruction of Krypton, Luthor is able to piece it together and to find the specific meteorite that he needs based on the math that he uses and the logic that he uses. So it isn't as if Luthor's logic is flawed. It's just weird that they don't seem to match up.
But it probably made sense to you when you were 5.
It made perfect sense to me when I was 5. Yes.
I had a quick little tidbit of trivia. The exterior of the Arctic here, before we get inside the Fortress of Solitude, was shot in Pinewood Studios in UK, which is like probably the biggest film studio in the world, which they shot a lot of James Bond stuff, but also the exteriors of Gotham City in Tim Burton's Batman, which was built in this.
Oh.
So the Fortress of Solitude and Gotham City basically were shot in the same place, which is an interesting connection.
World's finest studio.
All right.
Yeah, for sure. So then we have that transformation of, the young Jeff East standing there playing Clark Kent, and then they sort of dissolve into Superman, and this is really the first test shot of him flying, and they spend a lot of time getting this right. And for 1970s technology, even watching this today, it looks pretty amazing as far as the flight goes.
Yeah, it's a pretty quick shot. I know this is the first time we see Christopher Reeve, and it's also the first time we see the Superman suit, and it happens in 3 seconds or something. It's really quick.
Yeah, they don't make a big deal, I guess, of the transformation or how that happens. Again, it's a bit of like Kryptonian magic. I guess it just sort of dissolves. It's a really easy special effect, but it's the first time we see Christopher Reeve. I have a list here of some of the actors who were considered to play Superman. If you can imagine what pop culture would be like had any of these guys played Superman. And I'm taking this here from Glenn Weldon's book, Superman, the Unauthorized Biography, which is a great book if you haven't read it. I'm just going to do this quickly. You can just sort of, as a mental exercise. First, we have Butch and Sundance, Robert Redford, and Paul Newman, which I think Paul Newman would have made a good Batman, maybe, but I'm not sure about Superman.
Maybe.
Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone. Bruce Jenner, Olympic athlete at the time, now Caitlyn Jenner. Clint Eastwood and Steve McQueen. Christopher Walken. Imagine that for a second. Warren Beatty. Muhammad Ali was considered at some point, if you consider his fight with Superman in that special issue drawn by Neil Adams.
Wow.
Charles Bronson, Burt Reynolds, Chris Christopherson, James Caan, who had a connection with The Godfather, Mario Puzo, Jeff Bridges, the Dude, of course, Sam Elliott, Neil Diamond was at one point considered, apparently.
Wow.
And some of the finalists were Nick Nolte and John Voight, and of course they ended up going with an unknown, which was, I think, the right decision. And I think it's always great to have an unknown playing a character this big.
Right.
Yes. Well, I think that Christopher Reeve just really nailed it. He did such a great job as both Superman and Clark Kent, playing different versions of the same character, getting the awkward clumsiness of Clark Kent and the wholesome goodness of Superman. He does it with a little bit of a gleam in his eye, a little wink, but he is Superman.
Yeah, there's no doubt that he absolutely knocked it out of the park in every way possible, I don't think.
You really have to have sort of the quiet confidence to put on that suit and not seem ridiculous in the live action setting. And I never questioned it, that he wasn't Superman. And I think it's interesting, if you go back and look at the casting videos, the screen tests, when he first appears in that suit, he's kind of scrawny. He's not the bulky Superman that you'll see in the movie. And it's clear that they were casting based on the personality. They weren't looking at the physical form. You could bulk up someone, but you really got to have the personality. And I think they totally nailed it.
Well, not just personality. I think there's another thing that has to go along with it that he had, and it was a sense of presence. And some of that gets into, I think sometimes when we see smaller actors, shorter guys, try and pull this off, they can bulk up, but they can't get taller. And they can't make their shoulders necessarily broad enough so that they really sell it. And so he had I would add both physical stature, and that gets into height and proportion more so than it does bulking up, as well as this presence that made it work as Superman. And that's where so often you don't get that effect.
Mm-hmm. I've always just taken it as a granted that Christopher Reeve is Superman in the same way that, we breathe oxygen. It's just a fact.
Right.
I mean, it's hard to have any kind of context or perspective on it because before I was born, he was Superman. So, and probably always will be to most of us. So once we've left behind the second environment, that sort of pastoral, Kansas. We've ended up in Metropolis at the Daily Planet. And interesting that our introduction to the Daily Planet is through Jimmy Olsen's lens, which I thought was a great way to introduce that.
That was a very interesting perspective to see it through. We're not going through Clark's interpretation. We're getting Jimmy's perspective at this moment. And it's interesting that the movie sometimes shifts perspective to other characters who aren't Superman. It's not, even though it's really Kal-El's story, his journey, but sometimes we'll get the viewpoint of Jimmy Olsen or the inner dialogue of Lois Lane, or these other characters.
Right. And I think the last time we saw Jimmy on screen, he wasn't really a photographer in the George Reeves Superman show. He was just a reporter. I don't remember him being a photographer. I'm sure they've established that in the comics, but it seems like they're establishing Jimmy Olsen is the photographer here in this scene. And of course, again, we get our introduction to Margot Kidder as Lois Lane. Again, like you said, Dan, a different kind of presence.
Right.
Like a nervous energy and like really endearing quirks to Lois Lane, which is, I think Margot Kidder brought a lot of herself into this, which is great.
I love that she can't spell.
Yeah, the inability to spell. And it even means more now because of spell check, right? But that was absolutely brilliant.
Like Pulitzer Prize winning, one of the best reporters in the world, and this is her Achilles heel. She cannot spell. And then, a different kind of nervous energy is Clark Kent's introduction. Bumbling, klutzy. His face is rubbery like a Jim Carrey. It's kind of very expressive when he's portraying Clark. And for whatever reason, I must have been also watching The Muppet Show along this time. I always feel like the Kermit the Frog vibe out of the sort of this nervous about to fall apart kind of Clark Kent. And then we get out to the street and the famous mugging scene in the alley, where we really do see Clark's power and able to catch the bullet. And we saw the recent Wonder Woman film pay homage to this, where Diana blocks the assassin's bullet for Steve Trevor.
Yeah, that was a beautiful callback.
Right.
Yeah, it was a very obvious callback, that's the kind of thing we're doing this podcast for, honestly, to see how these movies have influenced the future movies and see the influence of the comics on these films. And I really enjoy those little details. And then our introduction to Ned Beatty as Otis, adding a bit more comedy into the mix. And Otis is heading down under Grand Central Station to the secret door in Luthor's hideout. And I find it funny that we're not introduced to the villain until about an hour into the film, and that there's up to this point not a conflict yet.
Right.
I don't think that's a bad thing. I think this movie is long. There are a couple scenes maybe you could trim a bit from, but I could almost see this being like a small series, like one of the Daredevil series or something like that. Like taking the time to really establish all these characters before you have the conflict. I really appreciate that. Honestly, I would have watched a 3-hour cut of this movie, but it's...
Yeah. It would be interesting to actually see it so it was fleshed out even more, the 3-hour cut that you mentioned.
Yeah, it's at times when you're watching this, it feels slow, but I think it's necessary. And I think it's clear that they were taking this seriously, and they weren't going to just dash this thing off in 90 minutes. They were really establishing something.
Yeah, there's a lot of great character moments. Even with Otis walking through the subway and buying the newspaper, but also trying to steal the pretzel, and from the blind guy, and then the dog barking and catching him, and the blind guy, well, how many did he take?
Yeah, we know Otis is bad, but he's not that bad, right? He's the bumbling sidekick. But then we are introduced to the big bad in Gene Hackman, who still doesn't seem that bad. There's sort of he can have an intensity to him, but he's not being that intense villain in this. He's still sort of likable in a way, even though he's planning to murder so many people. There's still a charisma to Gene Hackman.
Right.
That he was playing against type, really. And he famously did not want to shave his head for this, so they put him in a different wig in every scene, and at some point show all the wigs on the stand back there. And at the end they put him in a skull cap.
Which actually works in a sense because it does kind of add to his ego.
Right, like vanity. And then of course we're introduced to one of his first real estate scheme of many. We don't get a whole lot of detail on that, but we just, I think, show the map there. And then we're cutting back to Lois, and I think one of the best scenes in cinema history, at least certainly in comic book history, is the helicopter scene, which has been played out a lot in the comics as well. And they were supposed to shoot this actually on top of the Pan Am building, but they had a real helicopter accident up there a few weeks before shooting was supposed to begin, so they ended up doing the rooftop scene inside a big studio on the soundstage.
That's interesting.
But we get our first introduction to Superman, and I love the phone booth gag.
Yes.
Even in the 70s, you can't find a phone booth, like a fully functioning
Right.
phone booth.
Right.
And our first shot of Superman in costume going through the revolving door. We forget what the guy says who sees him in costume. Like,
Yeah, dig that crazy outfit, man. It was.
there you go.
I think he's like one of the few black people in the movie, and he's just so over the top.
Superfly.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
But it's not too shocking because this is like New York, right? It's like it's pretty normal. Metropolis is basically Manhattan.
I don't think they really even try to distinguish it. I think they pretty much just call it Metropolis, but it is New York.
I think the Daily Planet building is actually the New York Daily News. Yeah, and the Statue of Liberty later.
Mm-hmm. Right. Everyone has the New York accent.
Yeah, but Superman, rescuing her as she's falling and grabbing the helicopter, and the line, easy miss, I've got you. And her saying, "You got me, who's got you?" It's just one of the best quotable lines in cinema history for sure. And then we're treated to a montage of him stopping crimes, including rescuing a cat from a tree, which is something you probably couldn't get away with these days in a Superman movie. Certainly not with a Zack Snyder Superman movie. I can't see him rescuing a cat from a tree.
No, he doesn't care about kitties.
And then later saving Air Force One, which is a bit of a bigger task for Superman.
Right. I mean, I think it just shows the different scale of the things that Superman does. That, he rescues kittens from trees. He saves the president from crashing. He does everything in between. He stops a jewel thief. He stops some bank robbers and rescues people from an accident. He does it all. He's Superman.
Yeah, that couple of minutes really defines what Superman is to me, I think. It's not so much about, fighting big monsters from space. It's just like rescuing the common man, that's a very important role.
The other part of it is, it made us realize that it's not Superman just going out to solve one problem at a time, which is basically how a comic book is sort of written up until then, right? It is Superman's going out for the night, and whatever he sees, he's going to take care of. And I don't know what that little girl was doing up so late and out of bed and everything, but thank goodness Superman was there.
Yes.
And then we get to, again, one of the great scenes in cinema is this rooftop date between Lois Lane and Superman. And man, I don't know how much money she makes, but that is one fantastic apartment with a garden terrace. We have to suspend disbelief in a lot of other ways to make this movie work, and that always catches me off guard. I'm like, that must be millions of dollars.
Yeah. Lois Lane is loaded.
Maybe it's her father. Maybe her father makes a ton of money.
General Lane, right?
There's no way a reporter at Daily Planet is a millionaire. But yeah, this scene, like again, I said earlier about the sort of the ease with which Christopher Reeve does this. Like, there's a confidence in him that I would love to have. Standing around in these red and blue tights. This scene between them is just amazing in how at ease and confident he is, and very romantic. I mean, this is
there's so much chemistry between them too. It's great,
and the contrast of how nervous she is too.
Mm-hmm.
But she's seeing something that is beyond belief. Right, this man can fly, and yet there's nervous energy, but they're also comfortable with each other, which is really interesting the way they played that.
Right.
I mean, it also gets into like innuendo, right? She's asking like what color my underwear is, and can't see through it because of the lead planter.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really see that level of like sexual innuendo in Superman. You don't really think about it, and it's pretty playful and innocent.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting that it's there.
Right.
Yeah. There's more innuendo in the dialogue too. It's like how big are you? How tall are you? And
right.
What was the other one? Was are you normal in other ways? Like, do you? And then there's a pregnant pause, and then she finally says, "Eat," and he says, "Yes, I do when I'm hungry."
Yeah, I guess there was a more sort of liberal attitude towards sex in the 70s. I think we became a little more conservative as time goes on, but I think that was an aspect of the 70s that we maybe take for granted now. So I think what's really important is that this has a pretty high appeal toward women. When you're making a movie, and I of course bring up the Wonder Woman recently, that's doing great at the box office because you are hitting a broad audience and it appeals to men and women. And I think that's incredibly important in these films.
Did you mean to use the pun there?
What was my pun?
A broad audience?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Because that would be sexist. That wasn't a pun. But it's
right.
like when they say 4-quadrant movie. It's like you got to hit all the possible audience interests. I mean, this movie was huge at the box office
Right.
at the time. The most expensive movie I think that had been made, even more so than Star Wars, and that huge appeal is really important. I mean, the flying scene here is great up until the point where I think Lois has this internal monologue, which was originally written as a song because if you notice, her lines rhyme.
Oh.
And it makes more sense, even though that would be pull you out of the movie. I think it's strange to speak it out loud in like rhyming couplets. But I think I think that part's a little unnecessary.
I was wondering why she was busting out the poetry in the scene.
Oh, she's
in
a
her
writer.
journal. She's a writer.
She's
yes.
a writer.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, she's a journalist, and so I don't normally think of her as Lois Lane poet, but there she was.
That part sticks out. I feel like it maybe should have been cut there. That's one of the things in the movie I don't like, that one little part, because it's kind of odd. If you listen to the commentary track, there's a cute story about how they had to spend like 3 days basically in these harnesses, shooting this thing, and Christopher Reeve was never out of character, and Lois was just or Margot Kidder was always just kind of laughing and cajoling him, and Christopher Reeve would refuse to break character. And that's so we're still at 100 minutes into the film, and still there's not a real conflict yet. We're still building, which a lot of films would be over by now. And this is like an hour and 40 minutes. Again, I think the structure. I think the 70s allowed things to play out maybe a little more leisurely. Now we expect 3 action scenes to have happened by now.
Right.
I mean, we've got some action, but I really do like the pace. I think the first couple times I watched this, I was like, man, this is slow.
Yeah.
But now I really starting to appreciate the pacing.
Well, and especially because the pacing is devoted to character. And I think,
Right.
Obviously we have sat through movies that have very slow pacing, and and we're bored silly because they're kind of pointless. But in this case, when we're in Smallville, and which I just regard the entire Smallville sequence as brilliant, it is to introduce us we're being introduced to Superman by getting to see the realm in which he really grew up. I mean, that is who Clark Kent is. We meet his mother so that later when Lois says, I bet you send, part of your check home to your mother, and, he can say yes, that means something to us.
Mm-hmm.
And then that really helps define who Superman is later when we see him on that first night. So it all works, and that's why the movie doesn't drag.
Yeah. So then we cut back to Lex Luthor, who's now starting to execute his plan to steal missiles from the military. We were just talking about the pace. I think this section actually starts to drag a bit. Maybe this has played out a little bit too long with basically Luthor executing the plan, or at least this sequence of stealing the missiles. But there's also a cameo in here from Larry Hagman, who is not a star at this point, but a few years later would be probably the biggest TV star in the world, as playing JR in Dallas.
Well, he was on I Dream of Jeannie before this.
Right.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, he was not a dramatic actor at this point, but yeah.
Well, actually, he'd been in a couple of movies by then in dramatic roles.
So was he? Do you think he was a star at this point, where people recognize him?
A star? No, but I am wondering if at that point, I think Dallas was going to probably. Now I'm trying to remember everything in order. Dallas to me was probably a few months away from premiering. Not 100% sure. That's kind of my memory.
Okay. So Larry Hagman here is playing a general in charge of moving these missiles across the country, which there's a convoluted plan in which they reprogram the missiles so that Lex can control them.
Right. That scene is a little uncomfortable to watch with modern sensibilities because it's kind of like a sexual assault played up for humor.
Right.
It's
Tessmacher.
I need to do a chest massage and some serious mouth to mouth, to save her, and men line up around me and then turn around.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you there. I'm sure, again, 40 years ago.
Right.
How old is this movie?
Right.
Nearly 40 years.
Nearly 40 years. So.
And then we're cutting back to the Daily Planet, where Clark is in Perry White's office, and Lex broadcasts this high frequency signal that only dogs and Superman can hear. Lex seems to know awful lot about the Kryptonian physiology, and knowing what frequency he could hear, and then knowing that the kryptonite is going to affect him. You could say he's a brilliant scientist and figured this stuff out. That's one of his defining characteristics, right? But Superman homes in on that signal and then drills down into Lex's underground lair, which is kind of a cool special effect. It seems a little cheesy now, but it still seems like directly taken from the comics. Like that's something Superman would do.
Yeah.
And so at nearly 2 hours into the film, now our hero and villain have come face to face, and Lex is explaining his scheme in detail with the San Andreas fault, and he brings out the kryptonite and chains Superman up and dumps him into a pool. And he's explained that he's sending one missile to California and then one missile to New Jersey for some reason, just as a diversion.
Well, wasn't that the one that Otis screwed up, the launch sequence?
Oh, was that the reason?
I think I picked up on that for the first time this time. That
Okay.
That's probably what happened. There were two missiles. It was interesting that one belonged to the Army and one belonged to the Navy. They didn't want to single out one armed force as being inept, so they spread the ineptitude around. And the first missile that they tried, Otis screwed up the sequence, and so that's probably how it ended up in New Jersey.
See, I didn't even catch that.
Yeah.
This is like the 15th time that I've watched the movie or something, and then I finally caught that. Okay, that's probably what happened.
So Miss Tessmacher's mother lives in New Jersey.
Right.
She agrees to save Superman and that he will stop the New Jersey missile first. And Lex thinks that he can't possibly stop both missiles, which turns out to be true because that missile does strike the San Andreas fault. And there's a lot of great special effects work here in miniature.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of obvious now that it's a miniature, but I honestly sometimes prefer that over computer-generated graphics. There's a long sequence of destruction of, bridges collapsing, the fault collapsing, and an incredibly terrifying sequence that goes on for a very long time of Lois Lane falling into this crevice.
Right.
And they put her through such hell, like dumping dirt on her. I mean, imagine being this actress, being in this crevice and just having dirt dumped on you while you're screaming. That's difficult on an actress, I'm sure. And we get the sequence of Superman, basically restoring the fault by lifting it up from underneath and saving a bus, saving a train, but unfortunately unable to save Lois, which again, sort of terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And the original draft, I believe, the thing he does next, we're flying around the world, to reverse time. That was originally supposed to be the ending of the second film, where basically took the place of the kiss, where he gives her the kiss to
a Mind Wiper.
Yeah, gives her the kiss to Mind Wiper. So they moved that up into the end of this film, and this is another, I guess, controversial point in the film. This again, it's sort of beyond disbelief. I don't know, Dan, if you have any feeling about Superman turning back time.
Right. He can't. Kind of how I look at it. I obviously it links to the earlier comments from Jor-El, which tells him he specifically is not allowed to do such a thing. So, yeah, I it's understandable as to why they did it, but yeah, I would not have gone there.
Yeah. I've heard it explained in a way that it was basically in the comics, at least in the Silver Age, where like nothing was off the table as far as powers. He was able to travel in time by moving quickly and go back and see things, but not interact with it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
This has sort of been written off as maybe that's kind of what happened, but it seems pretty obvious that he literally reversed the Earth's axis and it spins backwards.
Right.
And again, we'll have to ask Neil deGrasse Tyson if that's possible, but I'm going to say no.
Right.
Well, and even if you could, that would not reverse time, right? So I think what they have said is that was more a symbolic shot so people knew we were going backwards or something like that anyway, but that's not how it would work,
Right. Yeah, if you reversed the axis and had it spin that quickly, you would destroy the entire planet and everyone on it.
Right.
Oh, Superman. What are you doing to us?
I think this is like nearly a perfect movie except for 2 points. So my previous point on Lois's monologue and the flight scene and then the reversing time. It's hard to state how important this movie was. And like I said, I was only a few months old when it came out. And Superman to me was Christopher Reeve, and all the four movies sort of blended together to me. Ranking the four of them all together, I think this might be the best. I'd go between this one and Superman 2. I don't know if you guys have opinions on that.
I would agree. I I would say this one is better. There are a couple of issues. I haven't recently rewatched Superman 2, but there's a couple of issues that I have, as you probably can guess, with Superman 2. But this is almost perfect. I would agree that the time travel to save Lois is a little bit beyond the realm of belief, but I can't think about it too hard. Superman's got to save Lois Lane, even if he can't. He's got to figure out a way to do it.
Right.
But once that happens, it's like, why doesn't Superman do that all the time? It's just a cop out. But Jor-El told him not to do it, so he just did it this once. So I guess he's just not going to mess with it again.
I look at it entirely this way, and you'd mentioned this earlier, but that is the idea that if you look at the times, if you look at the way comic book characters were perceived by the media, where really for the most part, and when I say media, not just media, but the public in general, for the most part, everyone was still remembering the Batman TV series, right?
Sure.
And then they had seen the Wonder Woman TV series. And that is sort of what was in people's minds when it came to the idea of, oh, that's what I'll see in Superman. It'll be full of puns and all sorts of illogical, bizarre happenings and everything else. And somehow, they managed to overcome that with some deadly serious sequences. And so if you look at the mountain they had to climb, and I think it's always important to do this anytime we analyze any piece of work, but if you look at the mountain they had to climb in terms of making the movie and making the public want to see the movie, it's a 100% really, hammer on the nail hit.
Mm-hmm. Sure. It's a huge cultural moment.
It was, yes, absolutely.
I think one of the things that Tom Mankiewicz mentions in the commentary track, he says they had this mantra of verisimilitude. We're gonna treat this the way it deserves to be treated, with respect and seriousness. And like you said, that was not what was expected at this time. It's confident in what it is, and that's really important. So we should also mention that this was shot in conjunction with Superman 2, and there was some controversy surrounding Richard Donner. They had shot most of the second film too, and that he was basically bounced out, I think, because of some budget stuff maybe, and then there was some conflict with the producers. But I think for the most part, Donner is given sort of the authorship of Superman 2, and there's even a longer Richard Donner cut. And of course, we're going to be talking about that in our next episode. But so Dan, as you saw these as an adult, do you have a sort of a perception on like the films that came after it? What was your opinion?
I think that each one, well, the second one, is a little bit more what we would think of now as a conventional superhero movie. If we think of Superman battling the villains and everything else, it also advanced the Superman Lois Lane quite a bit, or relationship quite a bit. There are a couple of points in it that I dislike so much that it kind of gets in the way for me. And this is not my reaction now. This was my reaction at the time. And one of them was, Superman pulling off sort of the logo on his chest and throwing it and wrapping up supervillains. Mm-hmm. And it's like, what? Where did that come from? But I think what I am left with overall, and what really worked for me in seeing the movie the first time when sitting there in the theater, as an adult, is the earnestness with which it treated the Superman legend and the absolute, I think, dead-on casting that was used in the movie. We had mentioned Christopher Reeve and Glenn Ford and Margot Kidder before, but even when you look at the rest of the cast, I think, Gene Hackman as Luthor was really quite good, and they found some ingenious ways to approach the problem of an actor not wanting to shave his head. At first, it's weird. At first, Jor-El was a little bit hard to take in the white wig. He was a little too pompous almost. But at the same time, the way the movie ended playing out, that's kind of who he had to be. Because when you think about it, someone being convinced that their world is going to explode, you can't get anybody to buy into the theory. So you have to know what you're dealing with if you're going to put your only son in a rocket and send him away, right? So I just look back at it. as something that worked on just about every single level that it had to.
Great. So another question for you. Since you said in college when you first saw this, at what point were you in your comic book career? And can you tell us how this movie inspired you to go on? Because you were sort of one of the definitive Superman artists. I mean, certainly for my generation.
So I would have been working with DC like about 3 years later. And, even right away, it was a couple of years before I ended up working on Superman. But I think what you saw as by virtue of that movie is that Superman became, I think, redefined in the comics as well. And some of that, I think, was fully realized when John Byrne came and redid the character, because he really took, and you can see it in his first works on Superman, he took elements of that movie, and it has definitely influenced what he did on the page. And then I kind of moved in after him, and that was there to work with. So really, you kind of had the comic book for years and years out there, which set up and shaped the movie along with the radio show. And then later, the movie coming back and really influencing the comics then and now. So I think it is one of those full circle type things.
Yeah, and again, that's sort of the theme of this podcast, is to see how the movies influence the comics, and like you said, full circle. To me, that's fascinating. It's this ongoing like cultural narrative, sort of this tapestry that we get to watch unfold.
Right. Yep. Totally agree. And it's for example, even in Action Comics, where we recently have done kind of not a redo of Superman's origin, but a representation of Superman's origin, where we've seen Krypton and things like that. Mm-hmm. As we discussed it and how we wanted to approach it, we touched on the movie. We touched on the works that came after the movie, because it kind of blends it all together. And you certainly now, I think, are at the point where the movie absolutely helped shape where we are in our understanding of Superman now. We talked about it with the crystals a little while ago, and the fact that they formed the Fortress of Solitude. That is now, and it was original to the movie at that time, but it is now every bit a part of the Superman legend. We saw it on Smallville, the TV series. We've seen it in the movies, and now we see it in the comics as well. So that cross-pollination, if you will, continues to happen.
And if you go back to like the radio show, things that were introduced in that show, like the Daily Planet, I think it was Jimmy Olsen first introduced in the radio show.
Yep.
These outside media that are melded into the comics, and we just take those as gospel, basically. That seems like it's always been part of the comics, even though it wasn't originally.
Right, exactly.
All right, well, I really want to thank you for coming on the show and continuing to read your run on Action Comics, which I've really enjoyed. Appreciate what you're doing over there.
Well, thank you. And it's my pleasure. I'm glad we finally got this done.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, Dennis, I will see you next time.
All right. Thanks.
Bye. DC Legacy Filmcast is a production of Halftone Audio. The show is produced and edited by me, Chris Ayers. You can find us online at dclegacyfilmcast.com, on Twitter at DC Legacy Films, and on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching for DC Legacy Filmcast. You can follow my personal Twitter at Chris A. Creative and my website at chrisayerscreative.com. You can find Dennis's website at comicbooklibrariansupreme.tumblr.com, where he catalogs the strange world of comics and his day job as a librarian. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.